The sky was silent, the stars scattered across the vast expanse of space like distant diamonds, twinkling in the cold. But something was wrong. The world below, Earth, had felt it. An unnatural tremor had stirred the air, and an ominous sense of something lurking in the depths of the unknown began to spread. No one could explain it. The night felt wrong. Jason Winters stood on the barren cliffside, the wind whipping his face, his eyes glued to the distant horizon. His team, scattered behind him, had already begun preparing their equipment, scanners, communication devices, and drones, all aimed at the strange anomaly that had appeared out of nowhere. "We're getting closer," Jason muttered to himself. His voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding him. A moment ago, there had been nothing in the sky. Now, something was there, a massive, unidentifiable object. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a plane. Whatever it was, it had appeared without warning, and the government had wasted no time mobilizing a team of experts to investigate. "Anything yet?" Jason's voice broke through the tension, but his tone was calm, almost too calm, given the circumstances. He was always the one to maintain composure when others panicked. But this time, even he was starting to feel the weight of the unknown. The technician next to him, Sarah, adjusted her headset and quickly scanned the sky again. Her face went pale. "It's moving. And fast." Jason squinted, his gaze narrowing as the object shifted across the sky. It was almost impossible to track. It wasn't like anything they had ever seen. No propulsion systems visible. No thrusters. Just the cold, mechanical precision of its movement. "Get the drones in the air. I want full visual on this thing, now." Jason barked, his command sharp and clear. The team scrambled to obey. The drone buzzed to life, its rotors cutting through the night air. Jason watched as it ascended into the sky, its camera zooming in on the strange object. It seemed to shimmer, the light reflecting off its surface, creating a kaleidoscope of colors in the otherwise pitch-black night. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the object stopped. Hovering above them like a predator waiting for its prey. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping. A sense of dread spread across the team. Sarah, the technician, glanced at Jason, her eyes wide. "This doesn't feel right. Keep your focus." "We don't know what it is yet," Jason said, though even he wasn't sure anymore. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he took another look at the object. Before anyone could react, a deafening, high-pitched sound pierced the air. It wasn't just a noise, it was a frequency that rattled his teeth, reverberating through his bones. The ground beneath them trembled, and the team stumbled, trying to maintain their footing. A bright flash erupted from the object, blinding them for a moment. Then, everything went dark. Jason's heart raced. He could hear his team members shouting in confusion, but the words felt muffled, as if they were underwater. Panic began to spread. The flash had been too sudden, too intense. They were unprepared. But just as Jason's thoughts began to spiral, something else happened. A strange, metallic hum filled the air, followed by a faint rumble. Slowly, the darkness lifted, and Jason squinted against the now dim light. The object was gone. In its place, a massive, gaping hole had appeared in the sky, a portal. It seemed to stretch endlessly, a swirling vortex of colors that were unlike anything he had ever seen. "What the hell is that?" Sarah gasped, her voice cracking with fear. Jason's mind raced. The data from the drones had been wiped. Everything they had gathered in the last few minutes, gone. Like it had never existed. And then, as if the world itself was holding its breath, a figure appeared in the center of the swirling vortex. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could identify. The figure was tall, its body covered in a dark, armor-like exoskeleton. Its movements were fluid, precise, as though it was in complete control of its surroundings. The face was a mask, alien, expressionless, but the eyes, those eyes, were cold, unfeeling, and empty. Jason's stomach twisted at the sight. The air around the figure shimmered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a flicker of something beyond the figure, something that could be worse. The figure moved forward, and with each step, the ground trembled beneath its weight. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. Then, without warning, the figure raised its hand. The swirling vortex behind it seemed to pulse, sending a shockwave that sent the team members sprawling to the ground. Jason scrambled to his feet, heart pounding in his chest. "Get back," he shouted. "Move." But it was too late. The figure raised its hand again, and this time, the sky itself seemed to crack. Lightning, but not like anything they had ever seen, shot down from the vortex, striking the ground with a deafening roar. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. Jason shielded his eyes from the blinding light. But as the light faded, the figure was gone. For a moment, the team stood in stunned silence. The portal was gone. The figure was gone. But the terror, the undeniable sense of something horribly wrong, lingered. Did anyone else see that? Sarah's voice was shaky, her face pale. Jason's mind raced, but his instincts told him one thing: the worst was yet to come. Jason stared into the horizon, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The faint glow of another object in the distance taunted him, drawing his gaze like a magnet. The world around him seemed to fall into a heavy silence, broken only by the shallow breaths of his team members, who were still recovering from the shockwave that had nearly knocked them off their feet. Sarah, the technician, was the first to break the silence. Her voice, trembling, barely rose above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Jason didn't have an answer. He had no idea what had just happened or why. All he knew was that it wasn't just a freak occurrence. Something bigger was unfolding, and they were at the center of it. His eyes darted around, scanning the darkened landscape. The night felt oppressive now, the once familiar and comforting scenery transformed into something alien and unsettling. The world that had been so full of life just hours ago seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next catastrophe. "Did anyone see that thing?" Sarah continued, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It looked like some kind of war machine. But not human." Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure if Sarah had seen it as clearly as he had. The figure, the creature, whatever it was, had been unlike anything he could comprehend. Its movements, its presence, they weren't from this world. The feeling of dread that had washed over him was still there, lingering like a dark cloud. The team had begun to regroup, collecting themselves as best as they could. But Jason knew that something was wrong. The way the object had moved, the way it had appeared, the way the ground had trembled, it was as if the very fabric of reality had been twisted. And now, the glow on the horizon was growing stronger, an ominous sign that they weren't done. "We need to move," Jason ordered. His voice was steady, though a storm brewed beneath the calm. "Get the equipment. We'll move out and investigate the source of that light. Stay sharp." He didn't wait for a response, instead turning to lead the group toward the approaching glow. He knew time was running out. They had no idea what was coming next, but they had to be ready. As the team gathered their gear, Jason couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. The first encounter had left them rattled, but this felt different. It wasn't just an alien presence. It was something far more dangerous. Something that knew them, understood them, and, worse, seemed to be playing a game with them. The faint glow in the distance flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. It wasn't like a typical light, it seemed to pulse, rhythmic, almost alive. Jason's mind raced. Could it be the same type of object? Was it the same alien force, or was it something more? And what did it want from them? As they moved closer, the glow grew brighter, its pulsating rhythm almost hypnotic. They had entered a clearing now, the trees giving way to an open field. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, and the silence was deafening. And then, they saw it. A massive structure had appeared in the center of the field, a towering monolith of metal that shimmered with the same unnatural glow they had seen before. It was unlike anything on Earth. Its design was sleek, angular, with lines that didn't belong in human architecture. It stood tall, its surface rippling with energy, like the very air around it was alive. The team stood frozen for a moment, their eyes wide with shock and awe. It was breathtaking, yet terrifying. There was no doubt in Jason's mind now, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some rogue alien ship. This was a deliberate act. And they were its audience. "Is it alive?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's hand instinctively reached for the communicator on his belt, but as soon as he touched it, a strange hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. He pulled his hand away, startled. The hum grew louder, more intense, as if the very air itself was charged with energy. Jason looked up, and in that instant, he saw something that made his blood run cold. From the monolith, a series of lights flared to life, bright beams shooting into the sky like massive searchlights. But this wasn't a normal beam of light. It was different, like it was searching, probing, scanning. Before anyone could react, the beams turned, now focusing directly on them. Jason's heart stopped. "Move," he shouted, pulling his team into motion. But it was too late. The beams of light suddenly expanded, enveloping them in an eerie, bright glow. Jason felt an overwhelming pressure crash against his body, as if the weight of the world had suddenly come down on him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, his body trembling as the force of the light pushed against him. "Jason, what is happening?" Sarah gasped, her voice breaking with panic. "I don't know," Jason muttered, his voice strained. "Stay calm, everyone. Stay calm." But it was hard to stay calm when the ground beneath them began to vibrate violently. The very earth seemed to be shaking, and Jason struggled to keep his balance. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The lights continued to pulse, and the pressure in the air became almost unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure released. The lights disappeared, and the rumbling stopped. Jason gasped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The team stood there, shaken but alive, looking around in confusion. "What the hell just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jason didn't have an answer. He looked back at the monolith, but it was no longer the imposing structure it had once been. Now, it stood silent, still, as though nothing had ever happened. The only trace of the encounter was the lingering hum in the air. "I don't know," Jason said again, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "But we're not alone. Whatever that thing is, it's not here to make friends." Just then, his communicator buzzed, startling him. He quickly reached for it, his fingers trembling. It was a message from the command center. "Jason, we're receiving reports of similar anomalies worldwide. They've started showing up everywhere. We need to know what you're dealing with." Jason glanced at his team, his mind racing. The message confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just happening to them. This was global. "We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought," Jason said grimly, his eyes scanning the silent monolith once more. But as he spoke, he felt it again, the strange pressure in the air, the sense that they were being watched. This time, it was different. The presence was more intense, more focused. Jason turned to face the team, his voice firm. "Get ready. This is just the beginning." Jason stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. The flickering light on the horizon wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just a signal. It was a message. He knew it. Somehow, it was becoming painfully clear that whatever was happening, whatever these entities were, they had an agenda. But what was that agenda? And what did they want from Earth? He turned to face his team, his expression hardened. We move out now. Stick together. Without waiting for a response, Jason marched forward, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The other members followed close behind, their footsteps heavy in the silence. Each one of them was still processing the events they just witnessed, but the urgency of the situation was undeniable. Sarah, the technician, walked beside him. Do you think it's a warning? Jason didn't immediately respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The lights, those pulsating beams, had already begun to fade, but the atmosphere was still charged. Whatever had just occurred was far from over. And he wasn't sure what they were supposed to do with the knowledge that more ships were coming. His team was vulnerable, exposed. They needed information, and they needed it fast. I think it's something more, Jason finally replied, his voice low. But right now, we need to focus on staying alive. As they walked, the terrain began to change. The forest gave way to a vast stretch of land that seemed to stretch on forever. Snow-covered plains, empty and desolate, surrounded them in every direction. It felt like the world itself had fallen asleep, as if reality itself was holding its breath, waiting for something catastrophic to unfold. The group continued to march onward, the distance between them and the monolith growing ever wider. But as they advanced, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation had been there ever since the first encounter, this unshakable sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, something that wasn't quite human. Finally, they reached a point where the glow from the horizon seemed to grow stronger once again. It was unmistakable now. The same energy that had flooded the air earlier was back, like a looming shadow threatening to descend. Jason raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. His eyes narrowed as he studied the strange glow. We need to make contact, he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He had no idea how they were supposed to communicate with whatever was on the other end of that light, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. Sarah glanced over at him, her face pale. How? We don't even know what it is or what it wants. We're going to find out, Jason replied. Now, we move in. They began to advance again, moving steadily toward the light. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to thrum with energy. Jason could feel it in his bones, this constant low hum, as though the very atmosphere around them was alive. As they neared the center of the field, something strange happened. The landscape before them began to ripple, as if reality itself was warping. Jason froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. The ground beneath them shifted, the once solid earth now seeming to stretch and contort like a mirage. He reached out instinctively, grabbing Sarah's arm. Get back, he shouted. But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet suddenly gave way, and in an instant, they were plunged into darkness. Jason's heart raced as they fell, tumbling through an endless void. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel the disorienting pull of gravity as if they were being sucked into some unseen chasm. His stomach lurched as they continued to fall, the air around them growing colder with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Jason's feet hit solid ground, his knees buckling beneath him. He scrambled to regain his balance, panic rising in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The air around them was thick with a strange, metallic scent, and the walls seemed to shimmer, shifting in and out of focus. They were no longer on the field. They were somewhere else entirely. Jason? Sarah's voice trembled from behind him. Where are we? Jason stood up slowly, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't like any place he had ever seen. The walls, if they could be called walls, were made of some unknown, iridescent material that pulsed with the same eerie glow that had bathed the monolith. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something alien, something he couldn't even begin to describe. "I don't know," Jason replied, his voice strained. "But we need to be careful." "Careful?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "Careful? Jason, we've just been, what, transported to another dimension?" Jason didn't answer immediately. The thought had crossed his mind, but he didn't want to voice it, didn't want to believe it. He turned to the rest of the team, his eyes scanning each of them. "Stay together. And stay quiet. We have no idea what we're dealing with here." But even as he said the words, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over him. They weren't just in an unfamiliar place. They were being watched again. Jason's mind raced as he tried to make sense of their situation. The aliens, whoever or whatever they were, had known exactly where they were, exactly what they were doing. And now, they were here. In this place. But why? What was the purpose of all of this? What was the endgame? Before he could speak again, a low, mechanical hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before, cold, calculated, as if something was preparing to awaken. Suddenly, a figure appeared before them. It wasn't like the creatures Jason had seen earlier, the ones that had destroyed the landscape. This was different. This was more human. At least, in shape. The figure was tall, its silhouette bathed in the same eerie glow. But it wasn't quite human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, deep and unsettling. Jason's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an alien. This was something far worse. "You have arrived," the figure said, its voice mechanical, yet strangely melodic. "You are here to witness the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Jason demanded, his voice firm despite the rising fear in his chest. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. "The beginning of the end." Jason stumbled back as the ground beneath him shook violently. The figure in front of them remained motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on the horizon as the walls of the strange chamber seemed to quiver and crack. A low hum echoed from the depths of the structure, vibrating through Jason's chest. The air felt charged with a terrible energy, and Jason had the unsettling feeling that everything around them was waiting for something. "Jason." Sarah's voice cut through the rising panic in the room. "What is going on?" Jason turned to her, his heart racing. "I don't know, but we need to stay calm." The shaking intensified, and the walls seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. A thunderous roar filled the space, deafening in its power. Jason's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. There was no way out. Not yet. The glowing figure shifted, its head tilting in a fluid motion, like something far more ancient than anything human. Its eyes flickered, lighting up the room with a cold, unearthly glow. Then, it spoke again, its voice resonating deep in their minds. "You are not meant to be here," it said, its words laced with both authority and a strange sense of sorrow. "But now that you have come, there is no turning back." Jason's pulse quickened. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, then with the others. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating him. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. "What do you want from us?" Jason demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain composed. The figure's expression remained unreadable. It raised its hand, and with a subtle flick of its wrist, the air seemed to shift. Jason's vision blurred for a moment, and when his eyes cleared, he was no longer in the same chamber. The walls had disappeared, and they were standing in what appeared to be a vast, open space. A city, or perhaps a structure, loomed ahead, a gargantuan, sprawling mass of metal and light. This was no ordinary place. The structure before them was unlike anything Jason had ever seen. It didn't conform to any known architecture or design. The shapes were organic and impossible, as though the laws of physics had been bent to create this unnatural place. It was like a living thing, pulsating with an energy that seemed both foreign and familiar at the same time. "This is our home," the figure's voice reverberated in Jason's mind again, clearer now. "And it is the last hope of a dying civilization." Jason swallowed hard, taking in the sight of the alien city. It was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The architecture seemed to stretch into infinity, the structures appearing to move and shift as though they were alive. Everything about this place felt wrong, but it was undeniable. It was a marvel of technology and design, far beyond anything Earth could hope to achieve. "What happened to your civilization?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's eyes dimmed slightly, as if in sorrow. "We once thrived, but our time is over. Our world is dying. The end is inevitable." Jason felt a chill settle in his bones. "What do you want from us?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. The figure was silent for a long moment, and then it spoke again, this time with a note of finality. "We have waited for centuries. Our people made a choice long ago, a decision that would shape the fate of your species. You are the key." Jason furrowed his brow, trying to make sense of the words. "Key to what?" The figure's hand rose once more, and the air around them shimmered. Suddenly, Jason was no longer standing in the alien city. Instead, he was surrounded by visions, flickering images of Earth, of cities in ruins, of people struggling to survive. It was chaos, devastation on a global scale. And in the center of it all, a massive, shadowy figure towered over the destruction, its eyes glowing with the same light as the figure before him. "You will understand soon," the figure's voice resonated again, sending a wave of nausea through Jason. "This is the future that awaits. If you fail, if you do not act, the Earth will fall." The images flickered out as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Jason breathless and disoriented. He felt a wave of dread wash over him, the weight of the figure's words heavy on his chest. "What is this?" he whispered, unable to look away from the now empty space before him. "This is the result of your failure," the figure replied, its voice colder now. "The end of humanity." Jason's mind raced. He had seen the visions of devastation, but it had felt too surreal. Too far-fetched. Yet now, standing before this alien entity, he realized that what they were being told was not a warning. It was a prophecy. "What are you saying?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That the end of humanity is coming, and we're the ones who have to stop it." The figure remained silent, its eyes glowing brighter. Then it spoke, its words reverberating in Jason's mind. "You have no choice. You have seen what will come if you fail. You must stop the one who will bring the end." Jason's mind spun, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was hearing. Who is this one?" The figure's gaze darkened. "He is the destroyer. The one who will bring your world to its knees." Before Jason could respond, the figure's form began to shimmer and distort, the edges of its body blurring as though it was dissolving into the air. "Find him. Stop him before it is too late," the figure said, its voice now fading into the background. And then, the figure was gone. The air around them felt heavier than before, and the disorienting sense of vertigo returned. Jason felt his knees buckle as the ground trembled again, this time with more intensity. The chamber began to dissolve, crumbling away into nothingness. It was as though the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. "Jason!" Sarah screamed, reaching for him. But it was too late. The ground gave way beneath them once again, and the world around them collapsed into darkness. Jason's head throbbed as he slowly regained his senses. His surroundings were dark, the air thick with an unnatural humidity. His hands instinctively reached for his head, trying to steady himself, but there was nothing solid to grab onto. The sensation of weightlessness lingered, like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering against his chest. He could feel the presence of something, someone, watching him. The figures were still there, hidden in the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "Sarah?" Jason whispered, his voice hoarse, barely a breath. "Sarah, can you hear me?" No response. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of energy in the air. Jason pushed himself to his feet, his knees unsteady, and surveyed his surroundings. The place felt ancient, alien, in every sense of the word. The ground was rough, cracked and uneven, like it hadn't been touched by human hands in centuries. Above him, the sky, or whatever passed for it in this place, was an eerie shade of purple, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with strange energy. The figures in the shadows stepped forward, their movements slow but deliberate. They were humanoid, but their forms seemed warped, distorted, as if they were struggling to maintain a coherent shape. Their faces were obscured by hoods, their bodies wrapped in dark, flowing robes that shimmered with an otherworldly light. Jason stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The glowing eyes of the figures bore into him, unervingly intelligent, filled with a silent understanding. Then one of the figures spoke, its voice like the rasp of an old, forgotten language, a sound that echoed inside Jason's skull. "You have come, too late." Jason's pulse quickened. "Too late for what?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that the very air around him was alive, pressing in on him. The figure moved closer, and Jason could see the outline of its face. Its features were a blur, but the eyes, those piercing eyes, were unmistakable. They were filled with an ancient sorrow, a loss that transcended time. "The war is already lost," the figure continued, its voice growing stronger. "You cannot change what has already begun. The one you seek is no longer a man. He is something else." Jason shook his head, trying to make sense of the figure's words. "What do you mean? Who is this one?" The figure's glowing eyes flickered, like a star on the verge of burning out. "He was once human. But now he is no more. The transformation is complete. He is the destroyer. The harbinger of the end." Jason felt a chill crawl down his spine. The figure's words had the weight of truth, but Jason wasn't sure if he was ready to accept it. He had to know more. How can he be stopped? Jason demanded, his voice shaking with urgency. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly. For a moment, there was a long, tense silence. Then it spoke, its voice softer this time. "There is no stopping him now. Not unless you become like him." Jason's stomach churned at the thought. "What are you saying? How?" The figure stepped back, and in its place, a vision began to form in the air, flickering images of a dark, twisted landscape. Cities burned. People fled in terror. The sky was filled with a strange, black storm, blocking out the sun. And in the center of it all, a figure stood, a man, his features sharp and cold, his eyes glowing with the same unnatural light as the entity before him. "This is what your world will become," the figure intoned, its voice low. "This is the future you have set in motion. He will bring the darkness, and nothing will survive." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The vision flickered again, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. The ground beneath him trembled once more, and the sky darkened, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Suddenly, a sharp cry broke the silence. "Jason!" He turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. Sarah's voice echoed through the air, filled with both fear and relief. "Sarah!" Jason called, stumbling toward the sound of her voice. He pushed through the darkness, desperate to find her. The air around him thickened, the shadows closing in on him. It felt like a maze. The path constantly shifting, leading him in circles. The pressure on his chest grew heavier with each step, until he could barely breathe. And then, through the haze of uncertainty, he saw her. Sarah was standing in the center of a vast, open space, her back to him. Her head was bowed, and she seemed to be staring at something on the ground. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. "Sarah!" Jason shouted again, rushing toward her. But as he neared her, something didn't feel right. Her body was rigid, her movements jerky, like she was being controlled by an unseen force. Jason's heart pounded as he reached out to her, but before he could touch her, a voice, cold and harsh, filled the air. "She cannot hear you." Jason stopped in his tracks, his heart racing in his chest. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in his mind. "She is already lost," the voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. "You are too late. All of you are too late." Jason's eyes widened in horror as Sarah's body began to change. Her eyes flickered open, glowing with that same unnatural light. Her once warm, familiar face twisted into a mask of cold indifference. "Sarah!" Jason shouted, stepping forward. But she didn't respond. Her movements were mechanical, her gaze fixed ahead, locked in a trance-like state. And then, the ground shook again. Jason barely had time to react before the entire world around him exploded in light. The darkness around him twisted and writhed, and Jason was thrown backward, landing hard on the cracked earth. His vision blurred as the landscape around him seemed to warp and collapse in on itself. The figures, those shadowy beings, were everywhere now, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Jason's mind raced. He had to escape. He had to stop this. But he didn't know how. The alien prophecy was coming true. The end was already here. Suddenly, he heard a voice, Sarah's voice, cry out in pain. "No! Jason, help me!" It was the last thing he heard before the world around him went black. Jason's eyes slowly opened. The darkness was complete, suffocating, and cold. He could feel the weight of his body pressing against something hard, like the ground, but it was impossible to know for sure. His mind felt fragmented, like a puzzle with pieces scattered across the void. The echo of Sarah's voice, her cries for help, still rang in his ears. The terrifying encounter with the alien entities and the strange prophecy weighed heavily on him. The last thing he remembered was the explosion of light and the growing panic that surged through him as Sarah's body changed. Had she turned? Was she lost to him forever? His heart raced. His chest tightened. He forced himself to move, his arms trembling as he reached out into the void, grasping for something solid. It was only then that he realized he was no longer on the alien planet. He was back on the ship. The metallic scent of the ship's sterile interior filled his nose, and the low hum of its engines vibrated beneath him. The familiar, mechanical sound seemed almost comforting after the chaos he had witnessed, but it was an eerie calm, a calm that belied the growing danger. Jason slowly sat up, pushing away the haze in his head. His limbs felt stiff, like they had been asleep for hours, or longer. The lights flickered, and he squinted as his eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the emergency lights. There was a quiet rustling from the corner of the room. "Sarah?" Jason's voice cracked as he whispered her name, but there was no answer. The rustling came again, closer now. Jason turned to see a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was familiar, but the shape seemed wrong. Too still, too mechanical. A twisted version of Sarah. Her eyes, those glowing, alien eyes, pierced the darkness, devoid of warmth, devoid of the humanity Jason once knew. She took a step toward him, her movements jerky, controlled, like she was fighting to retain some semblance of herself. But it was futile. Jason could see it now. She wasn't Sarah anymore. She was something else. A broken version of her, a puppet controlled by something far beyond her control. No, Jason whispered, his heart sinking. Sarah, no. Her lips parted, but the words that came from her mouth were not her own. The voice was cold, alien, and distant. You cannot save her, Jason. The voice was chilling. It carried the weight of finality, of a truth he didn't want to hear. You were right all along. This is the end. She is lost. The figure, Sarah, stopped just a few feet away from him. Her body twitched and convulsed for a moment before stilling again. Jason took a step back, the room closing in on him. His mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the flood of emotion overwhelming him. He couldn't let this be the end. Not like this. Who did this to you? Jason's voice shook with a raw, desperate anger. Who did this to her? The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. The one you seek, it said, the destroyer. He is the cause of this. The prophecy is his creation. He brought about the darkness. He is the end, and you are too late. The words echoed in Jason's mind like a heavy tolling bell. He had been chasing shadows, running in circles, and all this time, the answer had been right in front of him. The prophecy. The destroyer. Jason's blood ran cold. He knew what it meant now. The man, who had once been human, was the one behind all of this. The alien transformation, the destruction of everything Jason knew, it had all been set into motion by him. But what could Jason do now? Could he still stop it? Could he save Sarah? He looked around the room. The familiar walls of the ship seemed to grow oppressive, the air thick with tension. The silence was unbearable, pressing in on him from all sides. Jason stood up, forcing his legs to carry him. He couldn't just stand here and wait for his fate to be sealed. He had to do something. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the control panel across the room, his eyes scanning the lights and buttons in desperation. There had to be something he could use to stop this. Some way to fight back. But as he reached for the panel, the floor beneath him trembled. It was subtle at first, just a gentle shake, but it grew stronger, more violent. Jason's fingers brushed against the panel, and for a moment, everything stopped. The lights blinked, flickered, and then went out completely. Darkness engulfed the room, and Jason froze. He couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except the pounding of his own heartbeat. A voice. A low growl, unlike anything he had heard before, slithered from the darkness. You cannot escape. You are a part of this now. Jason whirled around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Nothing but shadows. And then, the voice came again, closer this time. You were meant to be the final piece, it said, echoing all around him. You were meant to end it all. Jason's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure, he was being hunted. The room was alive with an unnatural energy, and the very walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't wait any longer. Jason lunged for the nearest emergency exit, wrenching open the hatch with all his strength. His mind raced as he scrambled into the hallway, his breath ragged. But as he bolted down the corridor, the lights flickered back on, harsh and cold. And there, at the end of the hallway, stood the man. The destroyer. The one behind it all. Jason's heart sank. This was it. This was the final confrontation. The man stood tall, his body imposing and inhuman, his face shadowed by the glowing eyes that filled the space. His form shimmered, not quite solid, as if he were something between worlds. But what struck Jason the most was the expression on the man's face. It was not one of anger or hatred, but one of sorrow, deep, eternal sorrow. I didn't want this, the man said, his voice hollow, almost apologetic. But I had no choice. Jason took a step forward, his fists clenched. What have you done? You've destroyed everything. The man's eyes flickered. I didn't destroy. I merely awakened. Jason's stomach churned. The prophecy had been true. The alien forces, this man, had awakened something ancient, something that could end humanity. But Jason had one last chance. With a surge of determination, he charged forward, tackling the man with every ounce of strength he had left. The man's form flickered as if it were made of smoke, but Jason's grip didn't falter. He had to stop him. He had to save Sarah. The man let out a deep, hollow laugh, but there was no malice in it. Only the quiet resignation of someone who had already accepted their fate. "It's too late for me," he said, his voice breaking. "But not for you." Jason held on, unwilling to let go. The man's form dissolved in his arms, leaving nothing but the cold emptiness of the ship. The room grew silent again, save for the echo of Jason's own breathing. And then, everything stopped. The lights went out. The ship trembled. And then, nothing.